Interviewing as a software engineer is stressful. You have behaviorals, technicals, multiple back-to-back hour-long sessions. You've made it this far into the process, and you don't want to screw it up now. So I made a list of the 5 things that you should never do on the day of your interview, from the psychological to the technical details, to give you the best chance of knocking your interview out of the park. Let's get into it. For a lot of people, your natural state while you're thinking is to be silent. Years of taking exams and studying in libraries have conditioned us to keep our thoughts in our head, and we're not so great at explaining them as we're thinking through a problem to other people. Unfortunately, in an interview, this is the exact opposite of what you should be doing, which means you'll probably need to put in an intentional effort to make sure you're talking through the problem as you're working it out in your own head. This is definitely something that you can practice ahead of time. When you're doing your interview prep, you can either record yourself and watch it back later, or you can pair up with somebody else and then they can let you know about all the things you were doing in your interview that you probably didn't even realize you were doing. In the interview, regardless of whether or not you get to the correct solution, your process for working through that problem is going to be super important. Being able to communicate and collaborate effectively with other people is a huge part of the job, not just being able to solve problems all by yourself. So, in summary, try not to go quiet for too long and just keep that dialogue running with your interviewer. There's 2 different things that I want to address here, but they both fall into the same underlying bucket, which is don't make any assumptions. The first part of this is unfortunately a side effect of how time crunched a lot of these interviews are, which is as soon as you start either reading the problem or hearing the problem, you immediately start trying to figure out how you're going to solve it. Either you're pattern matching it in your head of something that you've already seen before that seems similar, or you're just logically trying to work out what process you're going to go through to solve this problem. The thing is, interviewers often use variants of common questions that you might be familiar with a twist on them that requires you to change the way you go about solving the problem. But if you don't listen or read all the way through the prompt and you just jump in because you're trying to save time and move quickly, you might end up solving a different problem than the one you're supposed to be solving. Now, obviously that's gonna cost you time, but it's also gonna hurt you because it shows that you didn't pay attention to all of the details of the problem, and naturally most companies want someone who's detail-oriented. The second part of this is generally more applicable to system design questions, which is that the initial prompt that you're given by the interviewer might not include all of the important details that you need to know what you're supposed to be designing. And a lot of times this is intentional. It's not that the interviewer hasn't thought through the problem enough to know all the different constraints. They're actually just testing to see if you can ask the right clarifying questions to make sure that you're going to end up with the kind of solution that they're looking for. For example, if you're supposed to be designing an online video player, it's probably a good idea to get a sense of which basic features are expected, as well as the level of scale. Are there going to be 1,000 people using this per day? Or they're going to be 100 million people using this per day, and that's probably going to influence some of the design decisions you make. While you're going through the process of designing your system, you are going to have to make some assumptions. Just make sure that you're clarifying those assumptions with your interviewer so that they know what you're doing and that you can stay on the same page, and also just to show that you're thinking through all the different parameters of the problem space. Regardless of how good of a programmer you are, your confidence heading into an interview is going to play a huge role in dictating how things go. And the best way to destroy your confidence heading into an interview is to review a bunch of really hard stuff right beforehand that you don't know super well. To be clear, if you know you have weaknesses, use the days and the weeks leading up to your interview to practice. For example, if you're not great with dynamic programming and you happen to be interviewing with a certain company that has a reputation for asking those questions, it probably makes sense to brush up. But in the hour before your interview, do not go on LeetCode and attempt a new medium or hard dynamic programming problem that you've never tried before, because if you can't solve it, that is going to put you in the complete wrong headspace heading into that interview. The last time that I interviewed, I had interviews all morning, and I woke up at 5 or 6, and I just did some easy LeetCode problems that I had already solved. I wasn't trying to test myself or learn anything new. I was getting warmed up, and I was also trying to boost my confidence by breezing through things that I knew I wasn't going to have any issues with. To some extent though, an interview is just like any other exam that you would take in college, which means if you have strategies that work really well for you, you can disregard this piece of advice and just do those things if that's what you're comfortable with. But at least for me, I know I would much rather go into an interview feeling good and confident than feeling panicked because I don't feel ready. This is one that I shouldn't need to include, but unfortunately I do because it's happened to me and it's happened to other people I know. The company that you're interviewing with might send you some details ahead of time about what to expect. Maybe it's the language constraints or what tools you're going to be using, how many interviews you're going to have, how long they're going to be, and you need to operate under the assumption that on the day of the interview, any of those things might change. For example, I've had interviews before where I was assured ahead of time that I could use any language that I wanted, only to be told once I got into the interview that I needed to use a specific language. Or maybe you've been assured heading into the interview that there's not going to be any system design questions, only to get into the interviews and find out that you're getting a system design question. The point of me saying this is not to try to scare you, it's a reminder to cover your bases. Sometimes interviews will go completely smoothly, and other times things are going to come up that you didn't expect. Just be ready to adapt on the fly and don't do anything that's going to come back to bite you later, like saying you're an expert in a language that you don't really know, and then having the interviewer ask you to do the entire interview in that language. Most interviews are going to involve some level of time pressure, which means at every opportunity you should be looking for ways to buy yourself time back, not to make more work for yourself. Probably one of the biggest examples of this is when you're coding on a whiteboard. You're not going to have your usual muscle memory, and you also have to write, which is significantly slower than typing. And if you're using a language with really verbose syntax, this is really going to come back to bite you. Just try solving a problem with Python and then with C++ by hand, and you'll see what I mean. Now, there's a few workarounds that you can try for this, but whether or not you can actually use them is entirely at your interviewer's discretion. The first one is asking to use pseudocode. You can take a lot of liberties when it comes to syntax if you're writing pseudocode, but unfortunately, if your interviewer wants to test your competency in a specific language, then they're probably not going to let you do this. The second thing you can do though is asking if you can abstract things away or just write stubs. Instead of fully writing out a class or a helper method, you can kind of abstract these away, and then you don't need to spend time writing boilerplate code, which gives you more time to focus on the actual interesting parts of the problem. Interviewers will probably be a little bit more likely to let you do this one, but you do have to clarify, because I specifically asked once in an interview if I could do this, and I was specifically told no. At the end of the day, interviewing is tricky. Even if you're a great candidate, things just might not click on the day of the interview, or even if you do well, you still might not get an offer. But if you can keep all this in mind on the day of your interview, and you have the skills to back it up, you should be in a pretty good spot. Anyways, that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.